And we are live.
Hello, everybody in the other chat. Sorry about that. Welcome to Engage MOOC. We are a few minutes late. We had a serious problem going live and we had to move over to a different chat. So hopefully folks who linked in through edX will find us over here. We have shared everything on Twitter. Apologies for the delay, the confusion. Probably some of you were sitting out there going, I'm watching, where are they? And there's nothing worse than that feeling, except maybe for the feeling of trying to go live and not being able to go live, even though you know that there's people out there trying to watch.
There's 26 people joining us now. So
woohoo, welcome.
They've moved over.
Can we recognize the hashtag irony of talking in a MOOC about access issues and about how things come up that make it more difficult for us to communicate with one another and then be frantically trying to share a link?
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's how it works. Okay, so folks are here. Glad you made it. Welcome to Engage MOOC. This is engagement in a time of polarization. My name is Bonnie Stewart. I'm in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, and this is the first day of our 2-week pop-up MOOC with Davidson Now. I'm actually the only non-Davidson participant. I work at the University of Prince Edward Island, and I just wanted to say, in terms of day one, one of our key goals for this, it's a MOOC, but this is very much more of like a participatory conversation. And we see this as a way of convening a conversation about a topic that's timely and important and that none of us have all the answers to. And so this for us is an opportunity to invite everybody into a big, messy conversation together. In the discussion forums today, I saw a ton of intros, and even better, I saw people starting to talk to each other. And the big piece that makes a MOOC a participatory MOOC is when people actually don't just wait for us to talk, but rather begin to make those connections and make it a learning community together. And that's what we were hoping, and we encourage people throughout the 2 weeks to engage in whatever way that they can. edX will be sort of the base container for the course. I'm sure there will be technical hiccups and all those pieces, but we also encourage you to make the course distributed if you like. If you would rather respond to challenges or share your ideas on your blog or in a video, feel free to do so. Share it on the hashtag if you're on Twitter, or go into edX and add your post from outside edX into what's called the contribution hub. And so feel free to look around in edX and find ways to bring people to your own spaces and your own sites and your own domains, as well as having us contained here. Because the nice thing, if people are engaging and building sort of conversations and relationships, and we have a sense of, if you have a blog, where that is, then we can find you after the course is over too, and continue those conversations and continue those relationships. I'm going to turn it over to my Davidson colleagues to introduce themselves.
Oh, I'll go second. I'm Dr. Natalie Delia-Deckard. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Davidson College, just outside Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm so excited to be kicking off this MOOC, to be engaging with everyone. And I want to echo what Bonnie's, just that we're already engaging with each other 12 hours in is, I think, really auspicious in terms of where this is going. My research, my interests, it's all about collective action. How do people take an idea and make it into something meaningful for positive social change and sometimes for negative social change? I'm looking forward to engaging with those ideas.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sundie Richard, and I'm lead instructional designer at Davidson College, and I'm part of the course team. I'm very interested in this as a course, but also in terms of getting people to engage in meaningful ways on digital platforms and talking about how that works, and especially with as individuals, as collectives. So I'm very happy to be here, and I will turn it over to the other course team members.
Hi, my name is Ariana. I hope everybody's doing great tonight. I'm actually a student at Davidson College, really lucky to be a part of this project with everyone. I've found myself in the online education space for the past few years. At first, a participant, now still a participant, of course, in different MOOCs and different platforms that are available to us, but also more in the community moderation sort of aspect of that. So I'm really excited to be talking with you all. I'm really excited to explore the ways in which the answers to some of these questions about how we engage digitally can actually be found in digital education spaces. So really happy to be here with you all.
And hi, I'm Annie Sadler. I am the Digital Learning Fellow at Davidson College. I actually was a student at Davidson and graduated this past year. I am really interested in this as someone who's only worked in grassroots organization face-to-face. And so this is kind of a scary new space for me to explore. What does it mean to do this kind of organizing and this work digitally?
Sunday, did you want to talk to people about how they can engage tonight with the Hangout?
Absolutely. And so we have a couple channels that we're monitoring. If you have comments or you want to add something in or ask a question, discuss those questions here. You can add that either in the live chat, which is part of where you're viewing YouTube, if you have that on open in a browser outside of edX. And we're also monitoring #EngageMOOC. And so you can ask a question there. A third way, if you don't want to sign into either of those platforms, which is a fair thing, we're also monitoring Davidson Now at davidson.edu email. All right.
And we do welcome people to throw in. So the big question for tonight, what we wanted to start with, I have a longstanding history of not really liking definitions. And so we've started a course about engagement without saying, hey, this is what it means to engage, because once we say that, then you create sort of an inside that debate or outside that debate or outside that answer. And so rather we wanted to start with, why does engagement matter? And see if we can get to some shared sense of maybe what engagement is. However, do any of the four of you have a sort of working definition that you want to throw out in the beginning? Do you have a way of talking about engagement?
I'll throw in.
All right.
Let's talk about the ways that sociologists have understood engagement over the course of the last 50 years or so. It's this distinction between watching things happen and making things happen. Oh, I want to welcome Dr. Woodsy to the conversation. Joseph, how are you tonight?
Hello, how's everybody? Can y'all hear me okay?
You sound great.
Perfect.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Now might be a good time for Dr. Woodsy to introduce himself, and that way we can move on with this idea of what engagement is. Welcome. Can you tell us just quickly where you're from, what your affiliation is?
Sure, Joseph E. Woodsy. I teach here at Davidson College in Sociology and Africana Studies. Went to graduate school at Wisconsin, originally born and raised in Ghana, West Africa. Been in the US since I was 13. I don't know what else y'all want to know about me, but I'm sure as we go along, I will tell you much, much more about who I am.
Perfect. We're trying to get to some understanding of the ways that we're thinking about what the word engagement means. What is that concept? We throw it around a lot. Are you engaged? This lacks engagement. How do we get more engaged? But what is that? And I was thinking it through in the sociological sense, the difference between watching events occur and being a part of the events as they occur. But I want to contextualize that for digital spaces, right? Which really live in that gray area. What are your thoughts, either Bonnie or Sunday or anybody else?
Go ahead, Sunday.
Just very simply, I think engage and connect are sometimes used in the same way, but I think they're very different there's something about engage that, yes, it means you're interested or you're putting energy towards that thing. You want to be there, and it takes effort. I think that's a huge thing that we have to think about when we're talking about engagement, especially in digital spaces, because a lot of times people, their energy to engage gets dampened because of things that have happened. So I think there's something about the want or the energy that you put into it.
I think I think of it as an intentional term. And again, I'm the one who's very like, well, I don't want to define it because whatever. Because I'm always afraid that once you define, you do create a polarization. And that's part of what we're talking about. But I do think that there's an intentionality to engagement, although sometimes it does happen by accident that somebody gets pulled in along with kind of a movement that is already going. For me, the idea of engagement is really about either making a space. It can be inviting people to a table, or it can be forcing a space at a table that is an existing power structure and that hasn't previously made room for kind of you. And so once you've got that capacity, and participatory engagement is sort of the core piece that we're talking about here. To me, participatory engagement is engagement that involves kind of a large group of people often, or a large swath of people who have not traditionally had space made for them at a given table. And the emphasis of participatory engagement is often to shift that power structure, but not always. One of the things that I saw earlier on Twitter go by, and I shared it under the hashtag, was it was an article on how women, white women, played a particularly large role in the, I guess, fighting desegregation in American schools. It was a grassroots movement. It was a participatory movement, but it was actually to protect a power structure rather than to make room at a power structure. And so because power ends up being intersectional, and people sometimes feel like they don't have power even when they have whole bunches of power, it gets very messy once you start doing participatory engagement or trying to understand it. So.
And also, I think that we need to recognize the way the entire idea of what counts as effort, what counts as work, is classed, is gendered, is racialized. So you need to be able to get that chair to that existing table without being arrested. So now people who are fundamentally criminalized as a function of what they embody in the existing power structure are completely excluded, and they're just voiceless, right? While we spend time saying, okay, you've done a great job being engaged, person that is acceptable, right? In this whole, I think that the example of white women during the struggle of desegregation is particularly poignant in that way. Whose voices can we hear, and who are we willing to listen to? And this is certainly not to take away from the efforts of those women, right? They play an extremely important role, but they're allowed to play an extremely important role in a way that Black women aren't, for example.
Well, and they were pushing against desegregation, right? So just because you're doing something that's grassroots doesn't mean that you're doing something that is equitable or just for everyone in your society. It depends on how you identify.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are actually engaging in this chat on the YouTube channel. So right now we have like an ongoing conversation between Autumn, Edith, Celia, a lot of people. And I think Celia really summed up the point that we're getting at here, which is this idea, does engagement necessarily have any moral or ethical value? And she's specifically referencing the idea of neo-Nazis on Twitter. Does that fit into our definition of engagement? What actually confines this? Does it have any sort of attachment to it? So I think that's a great question to pitch to anyone who would like to answer that.
Anybody want to leap in on that? I'll leap in on that. I think that unfortunately there absolutely is, participatory neo-Nazi engagement on Twitter. We all encounter it. It is participatory engagement. There is not necessarily, from my perspective, a moral compass to this idea. Now, the framework of this course is to explore sort of a particular path towards democratic participatory engagement. And I certainly don't think of, I think that neo-Nazi participatory engagement on Twitter and democratic participatory engagement towards sort of a better public good for all members of society, those two things are counter to each other, but it's still participatory engagement. IMO.
Right, and I think that there's also these two parts of this question. First, the question of the ethical value, and second, the question of how this actually looks when we go online, right? Like, is our engagement on Twitter counting as something that we're considering participatory public engagement? So I think both of these questions are really intertwined, especially when we remember like what happened with all of the bots during the 2016 US election. We think about what counts as engagement when it's not even necessarily even an individual that's contributing their own intellectual thought. Perhaps it's somebody creating a program that's responding to people. So where we draw those lines, I think, is a big question. I don't know if Dr. Woodsey, I see you nodding. I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I think that's brilliant analysis of it. I think that's a really fine way of like forcing us to think about what exactly do we mean when people are engaged. I guess the small bit that I would add to all of this is also to think about our responsibility as people who are privileged enough to have time, energy, and resources to engage, to do this thing that we're calling engaging, right? As an ethnographer and somebody who studies poverty, I know some of the people that I spend a lot of time with are too busy trying to figure out how to put food on the table, or too busy trying to figure out how to pay rent or find a new apartment, or too busy trying to think about their folks who are incarcerated to do this thing that we're thinking and calling sort of engagement. And so I always try to, in that sense, their engagement is waking up and going to school, or waking up and putting their children in school. And so I think their voices in some ways matter, and how do they become representatives or represented in this. And so I think for me, it's also really important for us to figure out, how do we not do our engagement from the purchase of wherever we're at, but also perhaps standing next to the people who we are supposedly sort of engaging and fighting for.
So Joseph, do you think it helps? Sorry, go ahead, Natalie.
My thought was, when we're talking about this distinction between types of engagement and who gets to engage, oh my gosh, I'm using the word engage too much, who gets to be considered as having engaged, right? As opposed to, well, you just woke up and went to work, why don't you vote? You just put food on the table, why didn't you march? In there is this reality that silence isn't something that happens accidentally. The same people that control power, right, in this country and globally, are the people for whom those who are voiceless must go to work and must pay rent and must negotiate visiting hours. To go back to Roy, voicelessness is not accidental, it's silencing as an action. I just wonder, to Joseph's point, when we even use the word engage, how much are we buying into that?
Like, in the sense that the word is used societally, and I'm not a scholar who analyzes linguistics enough to speak to this. I hope somebody in the chat wants to throw in on this, but it is a word that tends to get used as if it is a good, but there actually are no cookies for engagement, right? There are no prizes at the end of the day. It does not necessarily help you pay your rent or get your tenure track job, no matter which end of the sort of privilege spectrum you may be on. Engagement often does not have external rewards. And I think the thing, yeah, go ahead.
If engaging on behalf of neo-Nazi causes is engagement, and I tend to think that it is, right?
Yep.
Just because I don't agree with the cause doesn't mean that the action doesn't fall under the same umbrella. Then is hiring a lobbyist engagement?
I don't know. I mean, and that's where, so there's a point on in the chat, right, where it's helpful, Mike Caulfield says it's helpful to separate engagement from participation. Those two are different things. Part of it, what Ariana had mentioned earlier, was the ways in which, for instance, Twitter bots at scale can push the sense of a public narrative, and people sense that something is happening. Right? Engagement tends to be around moving a dial, a social dial, in one way or the other. And if a whole bunch of Twitter bots can start to push things and it makes it seem as if there's a whole bunch of people out there who think X, when really those are Twitter bots or Russian Twitter bots or whatever, that's a misunderstanding of metrics in social media that stand in as representatives of people who care about something, right? We have a societal problem right now, partly because we mistake social media metrics for actual people who potentially are voters giving a hoot about something. But that isn't actually genuine participation or what I would think of as engagement. It's simply sort of media manipulation to push things in a given direction. I just wanted to go back to the question that I had for Joseph, because what you raised was the question of power. And if we're jumping in multiple directions, but I'm an educator, sort of first, and like my actual discipline is education. And so I tend to approach things as a teacher. And a lot of my work has been with different populations who may not have sort of a standard seat at the prevailing table that power sits at in their time. And so for me, the question is always, how do you open things up to bring people into maybe just the part of the table that you have access to, right? And so it isn't so much that I don't think that we can engage other people in some kind of super central way. Like it's really hard to shift things from here way over here if you're sitting here, but you can maybe make more room here, right? And do the analysis and the work that you need to do to make more space for people here in the part that you are, and then hopefully kind of begin to work together to whatever dial it is that you're trying to shift. But I think a lot of, for me, particularly in the political, and I don't mean partisan, but literally the small p political, the democratic sense of engagement, is about figuring out how to put people who don't always get to sit at tables of power together. And you can only bring people into tables that you have access to. So if you have central power in some kind of way in your municipality, let's say you have access to your city council, then maybe you can actually, bring people literally to a table they haven't been sitting at before. But if you're a teacher and you want to open someone up to ideas, you're going to have a very different path to that. And to me, those are all legitimate forms of doing engagement, but they're really hard to talk about as the same thing.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right, and I want to make sure that. Okay, I think you're absolutely right. I think for all of us in different spheres of life, we have different kinds of access to different kinds of engagement. I guess the question or the idea that I was trying to get us to grapple with is that we also must recognize that there are, in some ways, we've created. Life is such that some people also just do not have the mental bandwidth to do any more than they're doing right now, to just live, right? And so I guess I think about the ends to which we are sort of advancing or putting our engagement, this thing that we're talking about. And so if the end is just to figure out the level to which a lot of people can get engaged, I think we're miscalculating. I think the end is to figure out. So part of the thing for me is that, like, to what end? What are we doing all of this for? If it's to be able to create really interesting sort of charts to say, because of this hashtag, X amount of people engaged with this hashtag, or X amount of people did something with this. If we're counting that, then that doesn't seem as convincing to me. But I'm always asking, like, sort of to what end? Even political demonstrations and rallies. As a cultural sociologist, I believe in the power of symbols. They mean something. but I also sometimes wonder if some of us in the political left become so enthralled by symbolic meanings of things as opposed to how it translates into political gains or economic gains or really more sort of tangible things. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to get us to sort of grapple with, is that like, what is the end to which we're directing our action, and really defining that very clearly and moving around the end goal, and even how we measure success in political participation and engagement. I think all those things are really important to these conversations.
Can I redirect? Can I ask a question? Because we started with sort of the does engagement even matter, right? And then we're still trying to work around. This is why I don't like definitions, because I always end up kind of going in circles. Why does it matter? Natalie, why does engagement matter?
I want to just say something positive about the idea of going in circles. You're exploring the frontiers of what is possible when you're going in circles, right? And I think that there's something really worthwhile about that. And maybe I've spent too long in college classrooms, but I love that idea, right? What is possible? That having been said, why is engagement necessary? I want to pick up on what Joseph was saying, the difference between the hashtag and a real tangible change in lived realities, right? In outcomes for the next generation, and how this neighborhood looks today versus 20 years from now. We just got great news out of Florida. It started out as a digital organizing series of events, which moved into streets and protests, which moved into city council meetings, which moved into the state legislature. Today, about just under 1 in 4 African Americans in the state of Florida cannot vote, permanently disenfranchised. What that means is that 48% of Black men in Florida cannot vote, period, end of story, forever. What we've seen is the iterative disenfranchisement of Black people in the state, and Black interests are completely silenced. The entire idea of like an African American political community is becoming increasingly laughable in the state. It's put the last 3 governors in office. These are just arithmetic facts. Because of that engagement, that's changing. The Supreme Court just struck down the Florida Supreme Court, so not the U.S. Supreme Court, but the Florida Supreme Court. Huge, sort of the court of public opinion happens first. There is not significant public support for the permanent disenfranchisement of felons in the state of Florida anymore, and we will see that change, and we have seen that change, and it starts on Twitter. I think that questioning, is engagement most worthwhile when it translates over time into a real change, is a valid one. Why does engagement matter? Because Florida, and a million other examples that are less fresh in my mind.
So when people are sort of like, oh, look, what I keep hearing is everything's fake news, so why should I believe it, right? Why should I bother trying right now, particularly in the information ecosystem front of things, because a lot of people are feeling either by life circumstance, as Joseph was referring to, or just by sort of our cultural moment, overwhelmed and like the extra energy that is required. Because I do think of engagement on some level as always being just a little bit more, right? There's the cursory stuff that you're required to do to keep your body alive or keep your kids alive or, get stuff done. There's the letter of the law of your job if you have one. But then there's the engagement piece, and whether you're a teacher or a parent or in whatever context, to truly engage another human being requires giving that bit more. And so the reason that I'm interested in this question of why does engagement even matter is because I believe that it really does matter. But I think that we need to be able to make almost a value proposition on multiple layers and levels of society to say, here's actually here are some of the pieces why it matters. It can be problematic. It can be exhausting. It can be all these things. But here is why it matters. So, Ariana, Annie, for you, why does it matter?
Ask the millennials.
We did have a quick technical question that we were trying to understand. So somebody brought up on Twitter, they've been basically quote tweeting all the things that have been happening in the YouTube chat, and we're putting it on Twitter and using our hashtag. But one of them they actually responded to, they said, I'm silent here in the YouTube chat, but I'm active on Twitter. Does this count as engagement? Does it count as engagement to be showing up to an event, but not actually be leading anything, not actually be doing anything, to be like sort of just propagating the conversation or spreading it to other people? I think that was a question that was coming up. And then another technical question was whether the YouTube chat automatically disappears, or if there's a way that we can preserve that or make that populated on our edX. So I don't know, Cindy, if you have an answer to that. Sorry, not to redirect the conversation a little bit, but I'm sure we can return back to right where we were.
Cindy, do you have an answer?
I don't have an answer to that one. I'm just waiting to see if someone on the YouTube chat has an answer, because they all seem to know what's going on. So I'll see if I can crowdsource the answer to that one, and if someone wants to take an answer at whether or not the people who are spreading the message are participating or engaging.
Who's counting? What do you think?
Can you be me? I want to introduce the idea of the Overton window into this conversation. I think that it would make this portion of it a little bit richer. Insofar as I'm not holding a sign and I'm not burning anything down, and taking out of it the political process in which I vote or don't vote, does work to amplify a message, does work to move an Overton window matter? And is that engagement? And I think you can tell from the inflection of my voice what my thoughts are. But I'd like anybody to pick up on that, especially Annie and Ariana.
Dr. Woodsey, I know you're unmuted right now. I didn't know if you had something or if you want us to go first.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, one thing that I know has been coming up in terms of digital communities a lot is that there's this conversation around the ableism and the way that we actually talk about social movements normally, and that we only see people participating in a social movement as people going and protesting out on the street. And I think that a lot of the community of people that are differently abled and people that have disabilities have actually brought up a lot of valid points about the ways that their contributions to social movements have largely been invisibilized by this rhetoric that we propagate about engagement. And I think that it's really, really important that we actually do the work of making that visible and talking about the ways that, opening the Overton window or posting think pieces or spreading the message, or a lot of the emotional work that goes into actually maintaining a political community is actually incredibly important and challenging work that is really the only way that all of this gets done. So I think that that's one thing that comes to mind when that question came up for me. So.
Yeah. I think it's also really important to recognize that when people are engaging, there are whole forms of sort of openness and participation that aren't visible to us. And if you're already in an existing community, you may feel belonging and feel part of this movement, but there is always somebody who is looking at that and wondering if there's room for them. And as human beings, it's really difficult to just throw yourself into something. A few people may have the personality type or the capacity to ignore sort of negative feedback or their own fear and just be like, here I am, you've been waiting for me forever. But most of us don't necessarily have that strength or weakness, whatever it is. And so Wanger talks about legitimate peripheral participation in digital communities, which is the fact that many of us will often, the term lurk gets used negatively, but you need to watch a group and its social sort of mores before you go and wander in, right? If you walk into a mixer in a public event and there's all kinds of people there, you're going to probably, if you're a reasonably observant person, or you want to have social success in that space, probably considering what is happening there and what the norms are, and then trying to engage and connect with people in ways that kind of mirror the cues you're getting, are most likely to have you be welcomed in. And so, you know, it's the same with movements. It's the same with digital spaces. If you don't do what is expected, sometimes you will not be welcomed in. And so part of the becoming a belonging member of anything is that kind of period where you're watching, and we call it lurking online. But
yeah, and one thing that, oh, sorry, I'll be really quick. I just wanted to highlight something that I think that it would be Janine. Sorry if I mispronounced that. There we go. But Janine had said in the YouTube chat that I think is really, really crucial. The way that she phrased it is basically this idea that lurking, as we're going with, lurking in one community can actually lead to engagement in another. And I think that really summarizes a lot of what you were going for, Bonnie. But go ahead.
And then also, like, what's the difference between being a follower and being supportive and being a lurker?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, so this is actually connected into the thoughts that a couple of thoughts that I wanted to sort of throw in. One is that, like, I find myself being a different kind of participant in different movements. There are the movements that I know more, maybe I know more sort of experientially, I know more intellectually, and so I can find myself perhaps being more on the front lines of those kinds of movements. And then there are certain movements that I just kind of know, okay, so I will show up, I'll help make the posters, but I may not go to the rally, and I may not actually protest. And then there's some things that, like, I may not show up and make the posters at all, but I will be tweeting the hell out of it, right? Because I'm there in a different way. So I think it's because we can't all be everything to every movement, right? And there are a lot of different things that for various reasons strike us in different ways. And so I think part of all of this is having the, I don't know, some might call it maturity, some might call it the insightfulness to realize your place in different kinds of movements and sort of live there sort of comfortably and be supportive of that. In my view, there's nothing worse than somebody who shows up in a space that just because they're very active in one movement does not mean that you can just come and be the center of another movement. And those are the kinds of
movements.
Right. And those are the kinds of things that, like, you know, people going across different social, cultural, racial, ethnic, gendered, sexual orientation boundaries often find themselves in realizing that what makes sense in that space doesn't always necessarily make sense here. And so this sort of adds to us thinking and talking about engagement, because there can be different levels of valuable kinds of engagement in different spaces.
As we creep up at 8 o'clock, I just want to throw this in. It's slightly a diversion, but I think it fits. Why is engagement important, and why should we be engaged? We're alluding to ideas of who is a leader, who is a follower, what the norms are in a particular social space. Why do I need to be engaged? Because if I don't speak for myself, someone will speak for me. And I'm just shaking my head.
And I think the only way we change those norms also is to engage, right? Like, if we don't stand behind the things that we value and find some way to get to the table and build enough of sort of a human energy behind us, or alongside us, or follow in on other people's energy, but to make that shift, then we kind of end up accepting the status quo, whatever it is. To me, back to Mike Caulfield's point about sort of the difference between engagement and participation, I see engagement as a form of openness, right? So it's openness to new ideas and new practices and new things to care about. And whether it's me just as an individual sort of finding maybe new people to connect with that open up my world because I live in a small place, and even just being on Twitter for 10 years has given me access to conversations and worldviews and perspectives that I would never have had otherwise. That openness has been tied with engagement. Participation is, for me, after the openness is the deciding to actually contribute. And there are lines there that are a little bit different. One of the things that I'd like to encourage people to think about as they go through the course is at least to maintain kind of an openness to engagement. And then maybe there are those particular moments where this is, you kind of recognize, here's where I could contribute. Here's where my piece of participation is. And you may not see all those coming, right? The openness allows you to find those pieces and go, oh, this is where I have something to say. This is where I'm going to participate.
To what extent also can we be most useful in our engagement, in our participation, by amplifying the voices of others, by accepting the leadership of others who may have traditionally been more silenced, but we can work to expand and to help, as opposed to being like, I'm a leader, in most spaces, every space. Cautionary tale, I was having a conversation with a group of very well-intentioned, very privileged. They had done the Women's March, right? And now we're looking to sort of move forward with that. And one of the complaints that came up in the room was they were trying to help all these poor people. The words poor people got used hundreds of times in a half hour. And the poor people would never come to their meetings. And the poor people never wanted to sign their petitions. I present that as a cautionary tale, right? This group was very engaged, right? Very engaged. But to what extent are we working at cross purposes to our stated goals, right? By not being able to lurk instead of, yeah.
And so engaging for others rather than engaging with others is usually reflective of something that probably doesn't actually make a lot of change at all. It just allows people to pat themselves on the back.
Absolutely.
Right. And for me, that's the level, that's where I just sometimes you can't have patience for that. Right. So like if the engagement is the end, not a means towards something else, then I just don't believe you, because then it becomes a notch on your resume. It becomes a way for you to, something for you to write about, to go to graduate school or to go to undergrad, or becomes, in some ways is a way for people to deal with extreme privilege in other parts of their lives, right? It's the way to be able to wake up the next day and be like, hey, I am this or I am that, but at least I did this for these poor people. And you wake up the next day sort of feeling it's, and people of different faiths, right? Like for some Christians is a way to ensure that they go to heaven, and even that's not good enough, right? Because I think the point is to figure out, how do you make life better for people here? You know what I mean? So if engagement is a means to anything other than making life better for all of us here, then I just am not as convinced that you're actually engaged.
Which is a really great segue into, because we're going through sort of topic 1 in this course, looking at different histories of public engagement, different models of participatory engagement coming out of education, coming out of civil rights. We have these histories that we can draw on if we're interested in doing things. But now, in the last couple of years, we've seen a polarization in North American society, I think, and outside of North America that I haven't been witness to in 46 years on this planet. So how do we then take the ways in which people's engagement has been in our 24-hour news cycle and in the world that is so full of kind of everybody symbolizing and signifying, I'm this, I'm that, I'm this, I'm that, we almost can read people's forms of public and digital engagement at a snap judgment. And sometimes that has led to greater polarization, greater separation, difficulty, maybe lurking long enough to find common ground or find ways to work together. So thinking about those histories, how do we build on those for now? And we'll be taking that up in another hangout, which I promise we will be able to start on time next Sunday. And it is it 1 p.m. EST?
It's 1 p.m. EST.
Okay, great. Looking forward to looking through the chats and seeing everything that everyone has to say.
Excellent.
Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Have a great week. Thanks for joining us,
Good
Joseph.
night.
Bye-bye.
Good
Thank you
night,
so